Imagine both your sons fall suddenly ill with a mysterious condition, and the doctors can't explain it, and so they eventually say that it's a psychiatric problem, and they start to push powerful drugs. But your gut says that they're wrong. Well, that was the moment that Harvard psychiatrist Dr. Matt Bernstein went on a journey that pulled him out of conventional medicine and turned him into a pioneer in root cause psychiatry. Join us today to learn how Dr. Bernstein has used his experience to help his patients heal without medications. Dr. Matt Bernstein, delighted to have you on the podcast today. I think my audience is going to be really interested in your work, namely that you are a founder of Accord, where you use metabolic therapies to help people with mental illness, sometimes even severe mental illness, which is quite cutting edge, quite new, and very transformative. And I'm just, really excited to learn more about how you became engaged in this kind of work.
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm really happy to be talking with you and get to know your audience a bit.
Yeah. So, Matt, how did you become interested in using metabolic therapies for mental health?
Well, it sort of goes back a pretty long way in that, I was trained as a traditional psychiatrist back starting in the early 2000s. I started my residency probably in 2000, so 25 years ago. And I went to a really top quality program where we're supposedly providing the best possible care, and I was always pretty disappointed with the types of outcomes we were getting. I was always interested in working with people with pretty severe illness, things like, schizophrenia and bipolar with psychosis and severe major depression and things like that. And, I found that we could help people in the short term sometimes get out of an acute crisis. But then, when I started following people in outpatient work, I pretty quickly realized that we were not getting people back to their lives in a way that I thought, that was the goal. To get people back to their level of functioning, either in work or school or family. When people had one of these episodes, they sort of became part of this system where they would take medications. Sometimes medications kept getting added and they never returned to their full functioning, and they would kind of end up going in and out of hospitals. Often when they would stop taking the medication on their own, which, in the care system, we would get very frustrated sometimes. Why are these people stopping the medication? But I was always interested in why they were stopping and asking people and finding out that there are often very good reasons why people were stopping their medications, which we can get into. So fast forward, I worked on an inpatient unit at McLean Hospital, part of the Harvard system, for about 8.5 years. Did a bunch of other roles at McLean Hospital, and I always had an outpatient practice as well. But I left that inpatient world in about 2010. Started at this company called Ellenhorn, where I was a psychiatrist and became the chief medical officer. And I still have that role. And we were much more interested in other approaches, things like what we call sort of psychosocial rehabilitation, getting people back to their lives, purposeful and meaningful activities in the community, relationships, doing whatever we could with a whole team to get people back to school and work and living independently. And we, within that system, I could see that, when we could get those activities going again, it would often allow us to reduce medication and sometimes get people off of medication. It was almost like, if you could, be back in school or have a relationship that would take the place of some milligrams of these, medications that we were prescribing. And at the same time, we were, very interested in deprescribing. At that point read Robert Whitaker's books, Anatomy of an Epidemic and Man in America.
Yeah. What did you think about all of that? Because, you went to an elite institution. Harvard is right up there. It's probably the best. And,
I went to a pretty good residency. I was at Baylor. We did, and the contrast between what I learnt in these settings about how the medications work, how effective they are, and what I saw in Robert Whittaker's book, which is essentially the opposite narrative. I was brought up on a narrative where the drugs are safe and effective. It's proven. Sure, they're not perfect, but they're the best we have, and they're just the way to go. And then you get Robert Whittaker's book, his thesis is actually that the drugs are making people sicker.
Right.
I mean, how did that strike you? Because you meant, you got your education at the best university, that most people would think of when it comes to, getting a top tier psychiatric education. How did that hit?
Well, it was shocking. But really compelling too. At the time we invited, Bob Whittaker to come talk to us at our company. And, I was talking to him. I said, look, I was reading your book over the weekend, and, I was on my hammock in my backyard, and I told him I literally fell off my hammock, at certain points. I was reading this book. It was amazing to me what I was reading, because it was, really shocking in terms of, what I had been, as you said, not only what I had been taught, but, I was a teacher in that system as well. I was teaching residents for years on the inpatient unit. The PGY2 residents would come through, and medical students, and I was doing teaching rounds even at the time when I was at Ellenhorn back at McLean. And so not only, so it was, like I said, just shocking. And also, but like I said, compelling, because it really made sense to me when I was reading what he was writing and the data that he was showing. And, most especially this idea of antipsychotic withdrawal, which is something that I really had not been exposed to prior to reading his book. But it made so much sense. And there was great science as well, cited in the book about it. Because we would see this phenomenon all the time on the inpatient unit. People would be, diagnosed with a psychotic disorder or bipolar disorder, sent out on an antipsychotic medication. They would stop their medication abruptly because, they'd either gain 30 or 40 pounds or more, or they just hated the way it made them feel. They were cognitively dulled and had no motivation, and many other things. So of course they would stop their medication. They would abruptly stop it, of course, which we know is going to lead to a withdrawal syndrome. At the time on the inpatient unit, our explanation was always, oh, that's their illness coming roaring back because they stopped their medication. No understanding or reference to the idea that actually their, significant increase in psychotic symptoms or agitation was due to antipsychotic withdrawal. But when I read that, I was just like, oh, that's what's happening this whole time, that none of us were appreciating, while we were there.
And it's really, and just to fill some gaps in for the audience here, I know, if I recall from the book correctly, he talks about, something called supersensitivity psychosis, which was brought up from, previous researchers at, who were saying, hey, maybe there's something that's not so good about suppressing the dopamine system, because the body will push back against that and it will hypersensitize the receptors. So when you pull people off the medications, you can actually trigger a psychotic episode. And
absolutely,
I remember there was this whole line of evidence that he puts in there, and maybe I've read in other places, like, we've sometimes drugs like Haldol and other D2 blocking agents are used in for nausea treatment. As unusual as that sounds, that's that happens. And when people come off those medications, some of them will develop psychosis for the first time, which to me was always kind of, this isn't, there's something about withdrawal from the drugs that, sensitizing the dopaminergic system that for some individuals will trigger things like paranoia and psychosis. And then the other line that Bob sort of weaves nicely through his book is, when he talks about bipolar, and, many people will have something that looks like bipolar, if they have, they're using substances or they have a side effect to an antidepressant, or sometimes just manic episodes they may only occur maybe once or twice in someone's lifetime. And, they go into a period of mania and psychosis, but then they recover and they return to normal lives. But once you put someone on a medication, they might have only have had one, have been lined up for one manic episode. Maybe, a couple of years later, they say, okay, I'm stable now. They get tapered too quickly, and then they have another, manic episode or psychosis. And so we get these people who had these temporary problems. And for some of them, we're making them, we're sort of trapping them on the medications.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I think as a field then, and even now, we just don't pay enough attention to that aspect of, us as prescribers causing these further subsequent episodes. And once you see that that's what's going on, it makes perfect sense. But, I think we just, we don't recognize it.
I think to me, it makes perfect sense. And for you, it makes, I can tell it makes a lot of sense. But something I have to ask you about is, these criticisms have been out there for a really long time, before Bob, but Bob really popularized them. And, he came out, and then we had sort of the narrative management come in. So you had, groups that I would say have a vested interest in sort of controlling the narrative about the medications being safe and all of that, whether it was APA or whether it was, pharmaceutical groups, they jump in and the experts, usually it can be doctors who are heavily involved in clinical research. They'd say, Bob is just out for notoriety. He's just trying to make a name for himself by talking about something scandalous. They would say, in fact, Bob's actually dangerous. He's trying to scare people and stigmatize the mentally ill. He's scaring them away from life-saving treatments. This is a dangerous man who should be ignored. And finally, they would bring up counter evidence, which, when you looked at it, was so flimsy, it would fall down like a deck of cards. But for most doctors that I encountered, they would say, oh, well, there's nothing to see here because look, the experts have said that, Bob Whitaker is, is a crank, he's doing something nefarious. Why were you able to see through that and just say, this guy is really onto something? Because these perspectives that you and I hold now, these aren't mainstream perspectives. These are not, things that, that a lot of people were talking about. What was it about you that was able to kind of, despite all of the narrative management that has, been going on with these things, why do you think you were able to see through that and keep on going with this, interest to find other ways to help?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I've always been a little bit of a skeptic and a rebel from the beginning. I never joined the APA, even out of residency. I could tell I was like, I don't want any part of that. I went to one big APA conference and I was pretty horrified. So, I always had my eye on the ball of how am I going to help people get back to their lives? That's always been my lens. And, when I started learning about the holes in the data and different ways of looking at what I was seeing in front of me, which was that I was always very frustrated and disappointed by, the traditional approaches being able to get people back to where they needed to be, so I was always thinking about how are we going to do better? And then, I was really lucky too, to be in a context where, I was practicing with this whole team of wonderful people and this great company where we were thinking about how to get people back to functioning. And we were realizing that, the better we could get people down on their medications, the more likely they were to achieve those better functional outcomes. And, started reading on my own, this amazing paper, from this group in the Netherlands where they were tapering people off their antipsychotics after their first episode and seeing significantly better functional outcomes 5 years after the tapering process. That was really, life-changing for me as a doctor, because I realized that what I really care about, getting people back to functioning, actually is accomplished when people are on much less medication than being on more. So it just fit with, cause it fit with my goals and what I was seeing in front of me. It wasn't just, about narratives. It was about, this is actually what works. And then I started doing it and realizing like, oh yeah, if we can lower the doses safely, people are doing better, not worse. But of course, sometimes you would hit the limits and people would get more symptoms sometimes. There's challenges which we can go into, but the general approach, when I started applying it, which is probably back in, 2013, 2014, I started realizing it really improved the outcomes that I cared about and really what the people in front of me care about. They don't care about reducing their symptoms on a PAN scale. They care about getting back to their lives and feeling more vital and vibrant and alive again. And so if we can ally around that, we can come up with plans that really work to get us there.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it sounds so intuitive. You're at Ellenhorn, you're helping people with their relationships, you're helping them find meaning, you're helping them with their careers, you're lowering their medications, and they're doing better. But we don't do that. And I would say that's really unusual for psychiatric practice. We kind of have a system that's incentivizing doctors to see patients really quickly. And it's just, do we go up on the dose? Do we go down? Or do we keep it the same? And then really what you're describing...
In a 10-minute visit, there's no way to think this way. Because part of what allows, I think, it allowed me and I think others is you have more time. You can really get to know someone. They get to know you. There's trust built. Sometimes it involves really building trust with that person's whole, social system as well. Often, in a place like Ellenhorn, we'd be working with the younger children of a family. And, the family needs to be on board as well with the idea that, okay, we're going to lower medications. We may actually get a little more symptoms at first. We're going to be prepared for that. These things that, everyone told you to fear so much, like a little return of some paranoia or maybe an increase in hallucinations or a little increase in some hypomania in a bipolar person. That doesn't necessarily mean we're doing the wrong thing sometimes. If we can, hold on, those things after the reduction, those things will get better again. And then, greater functioning usually follows. And then we can go around the next round of dose reductions. So I feel lucky that I was in a place where, we had the time to really have all those conversations, which are really important and necessary to be able to take risks.
Okay. And, so walk me forward from here. So because I know you're at Ellenhorn for a long time doing a lot of these psychosocial interventions.
Right.
How did you shift to being so interested in metabolic therapies and founding Accord?
Yeah. So that brings me to a little bit of a detour in my life story and my family story, which I think is worth going into because I think, people will be interested. So this is now going back to about 2018. Been practicing this way for a while. And then we had this, situation in our family. We have 3 boys. At the time, one of them was 12 and one of them was 14 and our third one was 14. We have twins. And they, 2 of my boys, the 12-year-old and one of the 14-year-olds got acutely ill neuropsychiatrically. And, all 3 of them had been doing great. Part of that, happy, well-adjusted. I'm working as a psychiatrist. My wife's a psychologist. They were, doing well in school and friends and sports and music and all the things that, you would hope for healthy kids. And then almost seemingly overnight, they went from that to acutely ill with, inability to go to school, inability to think and even read and even watch a movie. And, severe mood symptoms and obsessionality, suicidal thinking. I mean, it was, really quick onset and very severe. And, it looked very psychiatric. We, at the time sought out, the best advice we could from doctors in our area. And we're pretty well resourced. And, we started trying various psychiatric medications for them because it looked like that's what they needed. And, not only was it not helping them, the psychiatric medications were absolutely making them worse. Not just, in the long run, but in the short run, they would take doses and get terrible side effects, get agitation. One of my sons, wanted to jump out the window, after he took his nighttime medications frequently. We would have to like tackle him essentially and hold him. And so that was, I was already skeptical and thinking a little bit differently, but then, really that, accelerated that whole process. So, we ended up abandoning these traditional ways of trying to help them through the mental health system and, sort of moved all the way into sort of these functional medicine approaches. And they ended up getting diagnosed with PANS, which is pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome. It's a umbrella term for what used to be called PANDAS, but it's essentially a form of autoimmune encephalitis. The immune system is attacking parts of the brain due to infections and sometimes toxins. We ended up doing these huge medical workups and figured out that the kids had Lyme and co-infections, as well as exposure to toxins such as mycotoxins from mold in our house. It took years to figure out, what was going on and how to help them. But then that really changed my perspective that, not only do we have to think more broadly about these medications, but we have to think more broadly about these conditions in the first place. These really might not be, some neurotransmitter imbalances. These things we call psychiatric diagnoses, many of them really might be medical, or neurological. And, I started thinking to myself as the kids were getting better, how am I going to, think about how to apply this to all the people I take care of? How many people in my practice, or that I'm going to see now or in the future or in the past, really have, some either autoimmune condition or, infection or, something, or toxic exposure or something along those lines. So that really led me down, a whole bunch of reading and trying to understand the biology at a deeper level. And, I was in a grand rounds lecture at McLean Hospital where I would keep going back, even after I stopped working there, I would go back and go to the lectures. And I was listening to a lecture from Dr. Chris Palmer, who was talking about using ketogenic diets to treat treatment-resistant psychotic disorders. And he was going into some of the biology, and it really made sense to me. And he was also talking about incredible transformations in people who had been on antipsychotic medications like clozapine for decades. And were still psychotic taking the medication, but then were put on a ketogenic diet and their psychosis went away within months. And they were able to completely taper off of their antipsychotic medication. And I was thinking to myself, like, wow, this is a really powerful approach. And it doesn't rely on the standard way of looking at things like it's just some neurotransmitter imbalance in the brain. This is a way at targeting the health of cells in the brain, but also throughout the body, improving the functioning of the immune system and the endocrine system and the GI system and all of these parts that are connected to the brain. So it really made sense to me, this idea that, no matter what the cause is for these things that we now are calling, a psychiatric disorder, whether it's, dysfunction or disruption in any of those systems, we can improve it through these approaches, that work on metabolism, because metabolism is universal in all the organ systems, all the cells in the body. And then I just started, so the biology made sense. It made sense to this idea that we have to think more broadly to help people. And then I was really compelled by how powerful the response was when people, did these interventions. Like a lot of things in medicine, I first tried it out on myself. I put myself on a ketogenic diet to see, is this going to help me feel differently? Like, how powerful is this? And it was really powerful. I felt
what did you notice?
Way better.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, here I was, I was, in my, late 40s and working hard and, but I was clearly, in retrospect, I was clearly insulin resistant. I used to have to eat, 5 or 6 times a day to keep my brain going to do my job. I'd have breakfast and then 2 or 3 hours later, I'd have to have a snack between breakfast and lunch, and then have lunch. And then I'd have to have a snack between lunch and dinner because my glucose would be crashing. I was in a purely glucose-based metabolism, put myself on this diet, started off actually doing some intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating. That was a revelation. I can go 16 hours or 23 hours without eating, and I felt all this energy, and my brain was clear and focused in ways that I had not experienced before. So much more energy for, like I said, for my brain, for working, but also just physically. I could go to the gym and work out in ways that I never could before. So I thought to myself, like, yeah, this is real. There's something to this. I thought I was healthy before that. I realized I didn't even realize how unhealthy I was. So, armed with that, I started, talking to people who had been in my practice for a long time. And, I started saying like, hey, I've got this new, approach that I want to talk to you about. And, some of these people had known me for years, and they thought, this guy's never talked to me about food before, the diet before. I think they were thinking this is strange, but, they were willing to listen. They'd known me for a long time, some of them. And so I convinced a lot of people to do some of these approaches, and the results were incredible. I mean, literally, jaw dropping, things that I had not been seeing before, in terms of reduction of symptoms and universally improvement in things like energy, attention and focus, mood, anxiety, sleep, all these things, just general feelings of vitality, and motivation, almost universal when people would do these approaches. And it allowed us to, continue tapering medications in people who, maybe had gotten stuck on their tapers, and couldn't get down below certain doses. This allowed us to, keep going, which is also really, really cool.
Yeah. And it's, I feel like the ketogenic approaches are just so especially powerful in our country, in the United States. When we have such a problem with insulin resistance here, and people have grown up thinking saturated fats are bad. They're eating a lot of carbohydrates, and their blood sugar is just crashing all the time. And
That's right.
It is a medical
Spiking
problem.
and crashing.
Yeah, spiking and crashing, and it is a medical problem that's leading to mood instability. And I often find that when people do keto, you can do a dirty keto, but most people just become more mindful about food in general once they notice improvements, and then they eat cleaner. And then all of a sudden, you go from eating, 60% of your calories with processed foods, which is frighteningly the average in the US, to eating whole foods. And then so all of a sudden you get away from all the preservatives and the chemicals in the food. And just generally, as your gut health improves because of the things that you're putting in there, and you're treating the insulin resistance that's been developing for decades, you start to feel better.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's different layers of intensity of these types of approaches. I mean, first things first is if people can clean up their diet and get off of all the ultra processed food and sugar and onto a whole foods, lower carb diet, that in and of itself can make a really big difference for almost anyone. But for what I find, and others who do these approaches too, if someone has had, one of these psychiatric diagnoses for a long time and had been on, strong medications for a long time, we often do need to keep going all the way towards a ketogenic diet, which has some additional benefits beyond, dealing with insulin resistance and helping heal the gut. The ketones themselves are a powerful signaling molecule in the brain and throughout the body to, really give a signal to mitochondria in particular. And I think that has this incredibly powerful effect, and sometimes not immediate. It can take weeks, if not months, of having the ketones up at a pretty high level. But then you start seeing these, really powerful benefits for even, what are considered the most severe psychiatric diagnoses.
Yeah. And so tell me about the founding of Accord. Why create a business or a practice, like the one that you've designed? What was the gap that you were trying to fill? What was the problem that you were noticing with patients, where you needed to come up with this solution? Help me understand that.
Yeah. So, like I said, I started talking to people in my practice about this. And, just to be perfectly real and frank about it, this is not an easy plan to follow. It's much harder than what we're often asking people to do, take a medication or a couple medications. We're talking about changing a complete orientation towards food and really following a lot of guidelines about how to eat and, what to eat and what not to eat. It involves things like, shopping and cooking for oneself, because you really, as you said, you can do a sort of dirty version of this where you're getting food from takeout or packaged food, but it really doesn't work as well as, I would say, you can still make ketones if you're eating that way, but it's not going to have the same brain health benefits. And so what I found was that a certain percentage of people who are really motivated and organized could do this on their own with my coaching and maybe the coaching of a dietitian, but a lot of people weren't able to do all these things. And in addition to the diet, I know that there's other things that are really synergistic with this diet that really also help heal metabolism and heal mitochondria. So that would be adding in things like exercise and really aligning with circadian rhythms. And then the other part that's really powerful is, mind-body practices and mindfulness practices really work synergistically with all of this as well. So if you add in all those components, which would be the ideal plan, it's just really hard for people to do that on their own. And so we decided that, for people who are really think they want to do this, but it's hard to get liftoff. It's hard to, do all those things at once and, really start feeling the benefits. Let's provide a place where people can get immersed in all of this and learn how to do it and be able to then sustain it long term after they leave the program. So that was the idea behind Accord, this idea that, let's make this so that people really can do the best version of this and see how good they feel. And then they're going to want to keep doing this long term once they have that experience.
I want to segue and just kind of ask you something that I've always noticed, which seems strange to me. Every time they talk about diet or exercise, whether it's in, the big journals, BMJ, and such, they'll always mention it as, this is a helpful addition to medications.
Right.
They never really present it as, this really should be something that you could try first. It's safe. There's no side effects, and it could have, and like you had mentioned, it doesn't have minor effects. It can have profound, powerful effects. It can get some patients, it can get them off Clozaril, the most hardcore antipsychotic after they've been on it for years. And so for some people, they're extremely potent. What do you think is going on? Why is there this narrative that, diet, exercise, that these are little things like kind of down here on the side, and the real treatments are over here, people, the medications, and don't be distracted by these things. What is going on?
Yeah, there's so many ways to answer that.
Yeah.
And, I think, just to be frank, I think, a lot of our colleagues, we all, we go to school for all these years and then we do these hard residency programs. And, I think there's this idea that as a doctor, we're going to do things and prescribe things that only a doctor can recommend. That's part of the deal when you become a doctor, I think. This is sort of, this feeling that I have this special position. I have a prescription pad, or now we have a, prescription software in our computer, but, and I'm the only one that can offer these things. So, I think there's a, sort of a protection, sort of almost like, we're a guild sort of thing. That's why I never joined the APA in the first place. It felt like a guild. And I never wanted to be part of a guild that's like protecting our own financial interests, essentially. And I feel like that's part of this idea of elevating, medication and denigrating the power of these more natural, approaches that, frankly have been around for thousands and thousands of years. Everything that I'm prescribing at Accord is, really getting us back to, appropriate evolutionary health, essentially. And, or ancient mind-body practices. These are things that we've known as a human species provide health and vitality for, for many, many thousands of years. But, I don't think, a modern doctor wants to think that way. Most modern doctors want to think, we have this new technology that was this brand new pill that was invented by, some incredibly smart chemists and, studied, with millions and millions of dollars worth of funding. And that's the real stuff, but so I think that's the mindset of modern medicine, right? Which is really unfortunate, because then we discard all of this wisdom, accumulated wisdom, from our species, essentially, over the course of millennia.
Yeah. And it's, I see like almost like a triple unholy alliance, when I look at it, I see drug companies, wanting to manage a narrative, the drugs are the answer. Obviously, I think people see that. But then I think the doctors, people can recognize that as well. But then the third person in the room who I worry about is insurance companies and the way that we're incentivized to see patients so quickly. And, when you have it, when it's, you make the most by seeing 4 patients an hour rather than 1 person per hour, and you spend more time with them and you get a better result, you're not really incentivized to do That's that. Right. You're incentivized to see more and more people. And in that model, the drugs are the answer. And so there's, right. because you can hand them out really quickly. And so there's all of these, it's really scary, I think, when you realize this as a patient, that there's all of these forces that aren't actually there to kind of help you. It's to kind of keep the economics of whether it's the practice of medicine or selling drugs or the commercial system. The system is really built to support the commerce of these industries rather than helping people.
That's exactly right. And I would even add in a fourth force, which is maybe the biggest and worst of them all, which is big food. These are multinational companies. They're even, have more deeper pockets than big pharma. These food companies are, they make all their profit off of ultra processed food. And the more processed it is, the more profit they make. And it's all designed, for, to be addictive, to get people to want to eat it and eat more and more of it. And it makes people sick. And I think, unfortunately, medicine interacts with all these big industries. Obviously medicine interacts with pharma, but medicine interacts with big food too. And eventually we end up with these, dietary guidelines, which essentially are making people very sick. And I agree with you, in the encounter between, let's say, a well-meaning early career psychiatrist who really wants to help their person in front of them get better, and that person obviously wants to get better. All these forces are aligning there to, they're really, both hands are tied behind their back, with all parties in that room to really get the outcome that everyone really wants and deserves. Sometimes it even, it's almost like dystopian. And I saw some of this, when I was finishing my training and it's where like, people will walk away from the encounter and it's like the doctor didn't look at me because while they were talking to me, they were doing their documentation on the computer. Right. So you have this like 15-minute encounter. The doctor doesn't even look at you. They hand you this pill. It's so, so like dark that it's memed, on TikTok and social media, pretty hard. These encounters with these really unpersonal doctors who don't even look at the patient. It's gotten to this level where people, openly make jokes about it, and it's frightening. It is. It's horrifying, really. Of course, now the big solution, I don't know, you're probably getting inundated with all these offers from AI companies who want to help you save an hour or 2 out of your day by, listening to all those conversations and taking the notes for you. And so you don't have to, write the notes anymore. So, not too enthusiastic about that, as you might imagine, but even though, obviously documentation isn't fun, but, we can't expect computers to save us from this. And that's, the thing I love the most about this metabolic approach is that it puts the power back in the individual's hands to, really take care of and heal from their own, whatever their condition is. I mean, everything that I'm prescribing doesn't need a prescription, essentially, it's, prescription, but, it's everything I'm advising, it's not really a prescription, it's advice, essentially. People can do this, at home. You can learn all of this, in, really, well-meaning, YouTube sites and, articles. And, the tricky part is when people are on medication and they still need help, from a real expert in lowering medication safely. But all the other aspects of this, can be done without, a professional. And that's the part that I find to be, amazing and the coolest part about it, because, that's what people, that's ultimately where the power should be. It's in the individual to help and heal themselves.
Well, Matt, tell us a little about the structure of the, what is it like how have you designed things at Accord to help your patients?
Yeah. So it's a really small program, first of all. And it's a little house outside of Boston. We renovated the place so that it has this big teaching kitchen. And it's really nice and bright. And we do have rooms where people can come and stay if they're coming from a different part of the country, or if they live near us, they can live at home and just come for the day. And, from the beginning, even before people come, they'll meet with the dietitian and talk about their own food preferences and what they like to eat, what they know agrees with them and doesn't. We're making a sort of food plan even before they arrive. We have a really great chef who makes ketogenic food delicious, and it's very whole foods, fresh. We usually recommending a sort of omnivore version of this where, there's some animal proteins and animal fats, but also plant fats and lots of plant material that doesn't have, a lot of carbohydrates. So, essentially vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, a little bit of, you can have a little bit of berries with it. And, we're monitoring things. So, I mean, unlike, most medication treatments where we're not monitoring a lot of biomarkers, in this case, we do have things to monitor. So we put continuous glucose monitors on people, and we can see what's going on with their glucose numbers every 5 minutes. That can be really illuminating. We're getting this pretty extensive set of lab work for metabolic markers and nutrients, and hormones. So we're getting a real thorough look under the hood as to what's going on medically and neurologically for people, and nutritionally. And then we are measuring ketones every day. And that's a really important marker for us to follow, because if we're doing everything right, people start making ketones, or ketones start to rise usually, at the end of the first week and into the second week. And usually right there, people start feeling more energy just from that. And, then we have lots of education part of this. The dietitian is educating people about food choices. The chef is teaching people how to cook throughout the time that they're with us. We're taking people to the grocery store, taking people to take out, or to dine out, and sometimes take out, to make sure people can order in restaurants and get the right kinds of foods. I'm teaching all about the underlying science of this. So the whole goal is about learning why and how this works and how to sustain it after you're done. We get people exercising right away. So we set people up with a personal trainer. We're encouraging them to go to the gym. We have people walking 3 or 4 times a day, including right when they first wake up for that morning sunlight to help set the circadian rhythm, and, weaving in mind-body practices, throughout the day as well, to get, and different people gravitate towards different things. Some people like breathing exercises. Some people like meditation. Some people like moving things like, Qigong or yoga. And so we're trying to get people to find whatever mind body practice really works for them. So like I said, it's sort of this full immersion in all of these things, and all of these things work synergistically to heal metabolism and to heal the brain.
Yeah. And so, if someone listening to this is like, oh my God, that's me. I've been wanting to do, ketogenic diet, but I just haven't found a way to make it work. Where could they go to find out more about this program?
So we have a website, accordmh.com, ACCORDMH.com, stands for Accord Mental Health. And so if they go on that website, they can learn more about the program. They can set up an appointment with our program director, who does all the admissions, and then also sort of oversees everyone's care while they're in the program. She's a wonderful social worker who has, a good amount of experience with this, but also just, in her work in the traditional system, always recognized that this should have been part of it all along. She had that same experience that a lot of us do, that, when she was in the traditional system, like, this isn't working, and why aren't we doing these other things? So they can, set up an appointment to talk with her. It is a private pay program. I wish insurance would cover this. It's going to be a while, I think, till we get insurance companies to recognize that this is a valid treatment pathway, which is, criminal in many ways that they don't, and not really good for their own bottom line in the long run, I think.
I mean,
we do offer some scholarships too, for people who can't afford the full cost. Yeah.
I've been so disappointed in the NIMH for numerous reasons. One, that they've never done like head-to-head studies between, drug treatment as usual and, psychosocial interventions like Accord, right, or even ketogenic and dietary therapies and exercise. Because, if we had something, some of these studies that maybe followed people for a year or two, you could take that and you could give that to an insurance company and say, hey, look at these outcomes. These outcomes are great. You should cover it.
Right.
I often find myself, scratching my head going, what are these experts doing over there? Because there's so much research that's really important that needs to be done. We got 20% of our population on these medications. We should be doing studies, but I think they act as if it's, the case is closed. The drugs are the answer. We're not going to really waste our time on anything else. Because for me, that's why it's not covered, because these studies are hard to run. They cost millions of dollars. They take a lot of time. And the group of people who should be doing them, it's really our government researchers, because, drug companies aren't going to invest, in doing studies that are going to show that non-drug, methods are going to help people as well. And so there's a serious issue where our research leaders are completely asleep at the wheel now. I do think it's unforgivable. It really bothers me that these things don't have funding. Yeah,
I agree 100%. We should have been doing this research all along. This is not news that ketogenic diets help the brain. They've been used in epilepsy for over 100 years. The neuroscience has been strong on this for decades because of the literature in epilepsy. So the neuroscientists have been studying this from a basic science perspective for many decades. I think the neuroscience is way more compelling about, how this helps the brain than any psychiatric medication. But the clinical data, should be there too. And it's not quite yet. We have, these large case series and pilot trials that are not controlled so far. And so, our colleagues in the psychiatry world say, well, those are not controlled studies, so I'm not paying attention. But, the one saving thing, even though our government's not investing in this, luckily there's this amazing foundation, the Bazooki Foundation, a family that has the funds, and they're funding almost single-handedly, a dozen randomized controlled trials on ketogenic diets and mental health that are all happening now. At some of the top universities around the world, in the US and around the world. There are some other countries that are investing, in Scotland.
Well, I think we have to stop for a moment and just acknowledge how crazy this is, that the government doesn't do it, but we have a very well-resourced family who was personally affected by this problem, who have taken it upon themselves to now fund research all across the country to investigate this. If not for if not for Matt, who was affected by this, I think that was his name.
Matt Kabuki. Yeah.
If not for him, then we wouldn't have all of this research happening right now.
But
which is crazy.
If not for him, if not for his family finding Chris Palmer and Chris Palmer putting him on a ketogenic diet, if not for him having this amazing outcome, and also if not for them being just incredibly generous, philanthropic, people who want to really improve the world with their good fortune, in which, many, many wealthy people out there do not act this way. Even if they did have a tragedy in their family and see this amazing thing happen. I mean, they're really not just putting the funds into it, really directing the research in a top level way. I mean, they're really finding the best researchers and really figuring out how the best ways to do this research. And so they've moved this field along so quickly in a way that it never would have happened if the government was responsible for doing it. We'd still be, it would still be just a few case reports from Chris Palmer and a couple other people. That's all we'd have at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. Outstanding. Yeah. Well, gosh, Matt, on that note, we've covered a lot. What else haven't we talked about, which you think is important or you'd like to share with my audience?
Yeah. I mean, I think, like I said, I'm just so hopeful about what this can do for our field. We've talked about the many ways in which it's broken. But I really feel like, individual people and families, grassroots is the way this is all going to change. Because we can't, even though I'm somewhat hopeful that some of the research dollars now are going to be directed in this from our government. We have a director of Health and Human Services who actually talks about chronic illness, talks about the role of nutrition, talks about, the idea of changing food guidelines and cleaning up the food supply. I still think, even our government is up against a big battle here with, the forces of big pharma and big food and medicine. I'm not sure how much that's all going to change from the top down, maybe a little bit, but individual people and families do have the power in their own lives to change what's going on for them and spreading the word and really creating a grassroots movement about, people being able to take control over their own health and especially mental health.
Good stuff. Well, Matt, It's been a pleasure to have you on, and thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak with my audience.
It's really been my pleasure. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
If this story opened your eyes to the power of metabolic therapies, you're not going to want to miss this interview with Lauren Kennedy West, who was able to come off her antipsychotic medications after 10 years of dealing with a bipolar schizophrenia diagnosis.